Joseph and Taylor, welcome to the Moderns. It is a real pleasure to invite you both to the program, and congratulations on this new interpretation, Taylor, of your album, Still. How did this come together?
Maybe about 5 years ago, I don't know when it was, call it 5 years. I had the idea of redoing um, this album acoustically, just to sort of see what would happen since I've been using a lot more acoustic instruments in my music over the last 10 or 15 years, just to see what would happen, how it would sound. And I tried for maybe an hour or two and quickly realized I was in way over my head. Um, I pulled out an electric piano and a xylophone and, tried some things and just realized to do it the way I would really want to do it. Um, I just, I didn't have the skills to tackle that by myself. So I shelved it for a while. And then after, um, getting to know Joe more and his work, um, specifically with our friend, Ken Kirshner, sort of translating complex electronic music for acoustic ensembles, I approached Joe with the idea, and and here we are. And he can probably fill in, you know, his thoughts on when I asked him about that.
Yeah, Joseph, what was that like? What was your initial reaction, and then what was the process like for you?
Yeah, it was interesting. I was a big fan of the original record from 2002, so much so that I was a little nervous to try something like this. Like Taylor mentioned, I had some experience arranging electronic works for acoustic ensembles through Kenneth Kirshner, who's on my has done some projects for my Gray Fade label that are you know, kind of in a similar vein in terms of the process. But what Taylor was kind of asking for was somewhat more complex in the sense that in Kenneth's music, he writes electronic pieces that kind of sound like acoustic pieces. So when you translate them, an electronic cello becomes an acoustic cello. So it's very, in a certain sense, straightforward. With what Taylor was asking, the original record, for those who haven't heard it, it's not really making any attempt to sound like an acoustic record. It's highly processed, highly filtered, and digital and electronic sound sources granulated, and filtered beyond recognition. So there was going to be a sort of learning curve to how to figure out how to get this to work for a sort of chamber group. So I was had some hesitation, but as a huge fan of the record, I figured that it would be fun to, try to approach the challenge with Taylor.
You describe it as reconstructed in the notes. It really is quite a dramatic adaptation.
Yeah, I mean, I think when Joe and I started talking early on, the idea was to try to get pretty close to the original, um, as much as you can with an acoustic instruments. Um, Certainly capturing the spirit of it, but getting as close as we could sonically, and ultimately not being too precious about it. That we fully understood that compromises would have to be made, and you know certain sounds would turn into other sounds and whatnot. So, um, but with that idea in our mind, get as close as we can, but let's not you know um, get hung up on trying to make it exact or giving us the freedom to um, to go where these instruments and these players want to go with it.
Are the two recordings complementary? Is this an evolution of the original concept, or do you see it in different terms?
I don't see it as an evolution in the sense that one's better than the other. they're very different. I mean, like I said earlier, to me, it's more of a version that I may do now had I, if it were a brand new record and I just had this idea in my head, maybe this is how I would approach it. Probably not fully acoustic, but it certainly, you know, sort of fills in some of the space of my own creative interests from the last 20 years, and where my own music and where my own interest has gone. But I don't think they're certainly complementary. We wanted the new one to be able to stand on its own. It had to. So we took the liberties changing some arrangements and, like I said, not being overly precious about, copying it exactly. But once you deal with these, uh, a whole new set of instruments with physical restrictions and things like that, we had to make changes, um,
Have you played the
ultimately to the arrangements.
have you played the two records side by side together?
Well, I'll mention an interesting thing there, which is that I don't know about all the, no, definitely not all the pieces, but several of them, I think you should be able to layer them on top of one another, and I think they will align pretty accurately. That's not really what you're asking, but I, in these arrangements, I really, like Taylor was saying, I think we accepted that acoustically and sonically these were going to be different recordings. But at the same time, I tried to really honor the structural sort of integrity of the original. So, because the original, it's very complex in terms of its rhythm and its form, in addition to the sounds. But I wanted to capture that in the arrangement. So I think if you do listen to them side by side, the sonics are quite different. The spirit of it is somewhat different. But the form and the structure, which is what I think really makes the music so successful, on both records, I think that carries across pretty, linearly.
What was the appeal to you, Joseph? You talked about how much you appreciated the original release. Why? What is it about that record that still is so resonant now?
Um, I think for me, it's a general quality of a lot of music that I'm attracted to. It's music that doesn't necessarily um, force the listener into any kind of contortions. It sort of allows you to observe an object as it expands and contracts, and it gives you the freedom to kind of walk around in that landscape, so to speak. I do like a lot of other types of music, I guess you could say, that are more narrative based, that kind of pull the listener through, by the hand. They take you through and move you through this kind of structure, like a song form or a sonata form. But Taylor's record, what I think originally appealed to me and still does, is how generous he is with the listener's, the assumption of the listener's attention span and the listener's engagement. I think the music requires a lot of the listener, but it also gives a lot back because, in a sense, not a lot changes on the surface, but the more the listener engages with the music, the more it is revealed. So I think there's a sort of yeah, generosity, like I said, and kind of optimism about how much the listener can really bring to the experience if they pay attention deeply, and hopefully that comes across on the new one as well as the old one.
And I think a remarkably influential recording as well. I've heard an awful lot in the last 20 years that you can link back to still and tailor a lot of your early work as kind of laying a path for some of the most interesting music that's been made in the last couple of decades.
It's nice to hear. I think I'll touch on a little bit of what Joe just said. And I think when I created this album, it was part of me was thinking about Eno's definition of ambient music, in which he described it as wallpaper music, um, that is both equally as engaging as it is ignored. And I never really you know, like that idea that um, ambient music could be or should be ignored. So, like Joe said, these recordings, they're long, they're repetitive, um, but they demand something out of the listener, to really, the more you put into it, the more you get out of it. And I think it's, um, sort of music that should be the opposite of ignored. It should really be all in, um, and paying attention. So I think, that was sort of, I think a lot of it was my reaction to that
Why do you think,
definition of
oh,
ambient.
sorry, why do you think you felt compelled to take a new approach to this, to record something acoustic? What was it in terms of your own development, musical development, and your own taste that got you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, since this record, I've used repetition and loops heavily in my music, but always um, with the idea of them constantly changing, subtle changes, not just static repetitions. And over the last, decade or so, I've looked to acoustic instruments for their natural tendencies to change just based on the way you play them. You're striking a mallet differently every time. So there's you can do similar things to what I'm after, and it just happens naturally with acoustic instruments, and you don't have to get in there digitally to you know make these changes. So, and that's something I've been using a lot in my music, whether it's an acoustic instrument or playing a loop manually instead of looping it with a device. So when we ask these players to perform these pieces, they're playing very long passages of, you know, short repetitions. And as long as we can get them physically to do, um, which was pretty demanding for them. But you get these natural imperfections and these natural, uh, changes over lengths of time that make it, really interesting.
Do you anticipate additional recordings of this nature? Is this a transition point for you?
Um, I mean, it's really up to Joe, I think, if he ever wants to work with me again after this one. Um, I mean, it's, it's not something that I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to go back to my entire catalog of music and redo it all acoustically. We do have some ideas of potential, future projects, but it was a lot of work. It was a lot of money. Um, I'm not eager to jump in and do it again right away. Um, but it was, obviously incredibly rewarding. Um, but in a learning experience to see what, you know, where this kind of thing could lead. I definitely can't do it myself. I would need someone, I would need a Joe in some form or another to get musicians and produce and engineer, the ensembles. But yeah, I'm sure there'll be something in the future.
Joseph, this is number two in your Folio series on the Gray Fade label. Tell us about your plans for the series and the significance of physical packaging.
Folio is a new release format that Gray Fade is introducing with this record, Taylor's record, and another record by the aforementioned Kenneth Kirshner. And it's a book format primarily. It's a hardcover, linen hardcover book that contains essays, musical scores from the recordings, photographs, as well as a digital download of the record in high res. I think part of the motivation for me, I love physical media. I think it's, as we were talking before, about engagement and about paying attention. I still think that the physical format offers something that I don't, as a listener, get out of streaming. Um, Gray Fade's releases up till now have not been on any streaming services for a number of reasons, but probably the primary one is that I really want to make a make attention the sort of centerpiece of this label and the music that it releases. Projects such as these, which take multiple years to produce and conceptualize, I don't think of them as sort of throwaway audio content. I think of them as something that can be engaged with hopefully for years to come. And the books, are in these two cases 120, 150 pages of writings, documentation, thoughts from the players, composers, arrangers, discussion of the music production techniques, editing techniques, and really doing a deep dive into how these things are made. So I think of it as a sort of conversation around the music and giving some context to what actually we're hearing. I just think that in today's sort of streaming economy of music, there's a lot of elision of sort of how much work and conversation goes into a project like this. And so I'm kind of trying to make that front and center with this series.
It does seem that the economics of independent music, I'll use that term broadly, are not working. The streaming services, the way that they've evolved, and more specifically, the decision Spotify made recently to not pay artists with too few streams. There's something fundamentally wrong with that. Is physical media, a return to physical media, the solution, or are you optimistic that we'll advance this in some way we haven't figured out yet?
I'm personally cautiously optimistic. I think that you see a lot with the resurgence of vinyl, a sort of need for this sort of engagement with music and art. And I think that there's been a lot of enthusiasm so far for this book series. I've been really encouraged to see the response to it. There seems to be a sort of need for it. It's filling a need for this kind of thing. That being said, I do think digital can be done well and can be done equitably and can be done in a sane way. I'm just not really seeing that emerging as a dominant cultural, movement right now. It seems like it's kind of a race to the bottom, and I feel like it's important for artists to sort of stand their ground a little bit. I mean, the economics of it are like you mentioned, a big piece of it. The streaming rates are pretty pathetic, but I don't see how that changes unless artists really start maintaining a little bit more control over their own art. And so, again, I'm not really a major player in the music industry by any means, but I feel like in my small way, I can at least sort of make a statement about what I think is one potential way forward.
I've often wondered if there's a model in which you have specialty streaming services. So the way you have like a Criterion channel in television
Yeah,
or art
I think
film.
that's beautiful. Yeah, I think the issue is really people are used to paying their $9.99 or whatever and getting everything that they could possibly imagine. And until on some level, until that model is challenged by some more niche streaming services. I mean, I've seen a few that do a good job, but yeah, I'm interested in this as well as a sort of a more art centric sort of streaming model. So it's interesting.
Taylor, what about you? Are you still actively buying physical media, or how have your taste evolved?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably more pessimistic than Joe is about the whole thing. I don't subscribe to any streaming uh, services, um, mainly because I just hate subscriptions. I do enjoy the convenience. I listen to most of my music digitally. It's usually in the car or streaming or playing from iTunes in the studio between projects. And I listen to vinyl in the house. Um, but like Joe said, it's a bit of a race to the bottom, and unfortunately, it's you know like Joe also said we're not major players, but it is the major players that are determining everything for everybody, and it doesn't work for the small independents. Um, the major players are making a lot of money, and not many others are. A specialty streaming, channel is an interesting idea. I think it's another um, trying to get people to pay for more subscriptions. I think the whole subscription model in general is terrible and wrong. From Adobe to, you know, apparently you can subscribe to heated car seats in certain BMWs. I mean, it's really,
Yeah.
everybody there's it's just ridiculous. So asking people, to pay another 9.99 for, the Criterion collection of music, is potentially a big ask. And until, you know, if they can still get it with their Spotify subscription, why would they uh, go to another channel? So everybody would have to remove it from Spotify, and it's just, it's a huge conversation, um, and I certainly don't have any answers. I just sort of go along with, you know, what the public wants for the most part, and we're also dealing with a generational shift. Um, I have two kids myself, and I've taught one, hopefully, you know, who really loves music, a little bit of value about buying music and supporting artists. But you're asking an entire generation of people uh, born into the idea that all music should be free to start paying for it, and I don't think that's going to happen. Um, and so that's definitely a hurdle.
In that sense, you have both seen this transition over the course of your careers, which is quite remarkable. That sense, as you say, Taylor, of content being free, that assumption is so widespread among so many listeners and viewers. How much more difficult is it to do what you do now than it was 20, 25 years ago?
It's really difficult. I mean, I keep at it because I love doing it. But now we're, in addition to, we just want to make and record and release music, but we have to become social media jockeys and, pander to these algorithms and, a whole other set of skills or, you know, uh, things that we're not necessarily interested in doing, but you kind of have to do it. Um, there's certainly something wonderful about getting your music out there so easily, and that's great, you know, but it comes at a pretty hefty cost. Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I find it much more difficult, um, at least to do it the way we want to do it, the way we'd prefer to do it. I mean, Joe's taking a great stand here um, with the Folio series, and certainly on 12K, I'm, releasing physical media for most releases, and it's difficult to sell it. The Postal Service makes it extremely difficult to ship it anywhere. That's another huge problem. Um, and it's a lot of the reason that even people who love physical media aren't buying it because it's simply too expensive to ship it. Uh, one little tiny CD to Europe is almost $20. And when I started the label, I remember very clearly, it was $1.56. And so not only have CD prices come down, I'm selling CDs for less, but shipping is nearly 20 times more. Um, so, you know, it's just a constant battle.
Hmm. What's next for both of you? I hope we're going to hear more collaborations between you two. Joseph, maybe you can share first.
Yeah, well, in the very near future, we're actually putting together a performance of Still for the release of the album in May. That'll be in Brooklyn at a venue called Public Records. And we have some of the performers from the record, as well as myself on vibraphone and Taylor on processing electronics, doing a sort of version of the record live. So I'm actually personally really interested to see what that turns into, because it's not, again, we're not really attempting to recreate exactly the record. It'll be sort of its own thing, but using these instrumentalists from the recording, cellist and clarinetist and guitar. I mean, as I mentioned from at the beginning, I've been a huge fan of Taylor's music for years, so it was a real honor to work together on this project. And yeah, I definitely hope there's more to come. Although I don't know what that would be. I think this record for sure took a lot out of both of us, and it's nice that it's seeing the light of day. So I think we're just sort of enjoying that for the moment.
How about you,
Yeah.
Taylor? What's next?
Yeah, I mean this one took, almost 2 years. Most of it uh, is Joe's doing. I mean, it was a lot of work on his part. So um, I hope we do something again. We have some, like I mentioned before, we have some little thoughts and kicking around. But we've also both got our own labels and other projects to run. So uh, I'm looking forward to this show in May. Um, it'll be interesting to see how we pull it off. We're gonna, um, like Joe said, just make um, not perform any pieces exactly, but sort of catch the spirit of the project with five or five or six of us on stage. Yeah, and then just keep at it.
Wonderful. Well, it's a wonderful record. It's an important record, and I congratulate you both. Thank you for this.